What if one of the most dangerous ideas in religious history was not the worship of evil, but the claim that most human beings are asleep inside a world they mistake for ultimate reality? That is the tension at the heart of Gnosticism. For some, it was a heresy. For others, it was a hidden key. And for nearly 2,000 years, it has returned whenever people begin to feel that ordinary life, material success, and surface-level religion are simply not enough. Gnosticism is not just an old belief system buried in dusty manuscripts. It is a radical way of asking why the soul feels exiled, why suffering seems woven into the structure of existence, and whether salvation comes from obedience alone or from awakening. To understand Gnosticism, we have to start with the word itself. The term comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. But this is not ordinary knowledge. It is not information, not scholarship, and not the kind of knowledge you collect and display. Gnosis means inner knowing, direct spiritual recognition, and the kind of insight that changes the one who receives it. In the Gnostic view, the human problem is not merely moral failure. It is amnesia. We have forgotten what we are, where we came from, and what within us belongs to a reality beyond this world. That single idea is one of the reasons Gnosticism has remained so compelling. It does not begin by saying you are simply guilty. It begins by saying you are asleep. Historically, Gnosticism did not appear out of nowhere. It emerged in the first centuries of the Common Era, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean world, where Jewish theology, early Christianity, Greek philosophy, Egyptian symbolism, and mystery traditions were all mixing in powerful ways. Alexandria, in particular, was one of the great meeting points of this spiritual and intellectual fusion. Long before formal Gnostic schools appeared, the ancient world already held ideas that prepared the ground. These included the Orphic sense that the soul had fallen into the body, Platonic distinctions between higher reality and lower appearance, apocalyptic Jewish visions of cosmic conflict, and initiatory traditions teaching that liberation required more than just public religion. So when Gnosticism emerged, it was not a random invention. It was a dramatic synthesis of older intuitions about exile, descent, memory, and return. In its most recognizable forms, Gnosticism flourished between the 1st and 3rd centuries. And what makes it so historically fascinating is that it grew alongside early Christianity, not centuries after it, but during the exact same turbulent period when Christians were still arguing over scripture, authority, doctrine, and the meaning of Christ. This matters because Gnosticism was not simply the opposite of Christianity in some crude sense. In many cases, it was an alternative reading of the same spiritual drama. The Gnostics asked, who is the true God? Why does the world feel broken? What exactly did Christ come to reveal? And is salvation mainly forgiveness, or is it awakening? For a long time, most of what people knew about the Gnostics came from their enemies. Church fathers like Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Hippolytus attacked them as dangerous distorters of the faith. But in 1945, everything changed with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt. Suddenly, scholars could read texts that spoke in the Gnostics' own voice. These were works like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, and the Apocryphon of John. That discovery completely transformed the field. It showed that Gnosticism was not one single movement, but a family of related currents. They were often diverse, sometimes highly mythic, sometimes deeply philosophical, but all centered on the conviction that the human being contains a divine element trapped in ignorance. Now we come to the heart of Gnostic cosmology. In many Gnostic systems, the highest God is utterly transcendent, beyond all simple images, and beyond the God most people imagine when they think in ordinary religious terms. From this ultimate source emanate divine realities, often called aeons, which are expressions of fullness, harmony, and spiritual order. But then comes a rupture. In several systems, especially Scythian and Valentinian forms, this cosmic imbalance is linked to Sophia, whose name means wisdom. Through a mysterious fall, error, or misdirected movement, a lower creator comes into being. This is the Demiurge. This figure is one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of esotericism. The Demiurge is not always presented as purely evil in a cartoonish sense. More often, he is ignorant, arrogant, limited, or blind to the higher source beyond himself. He creates and governs the material cosmos, but mistakes himself for the ultimate God. That is the great Gnostic reversal. What if the maker of the visible world is not the highest principle? What if the world is not false? Because existence itself is evil, but because consciousness is trapped in a system of confusion, domination, and forgetfulness? This is why the material realm in many Gnostic texts feels like a prison, a maze, or a veil. And yet, within the human being, there remains a spark, a fragment, or a seed of the divine fullness. The purpose of gnosis is to awaken that inner spark so it can remember its origin and return. This is also why Christ appears so differently in many Gnostic interpretations. Rather than coming only to pay a legal debt for sin, Christ is often the revealer, the awakener, and the one who descends into the world of sleep to remind souls of who they really are. That is a very different spiritual emphasis. It shifts the center from external conformity to inner illumination. And in my view, that is one reason Gnosticism keeps resurfacing in every age that feels spiritually suffocated by empty forms. It speaks to people who sense that ritual without transformation is simply not enough. Not all Gnostics believed exactly the same things. The Scythians often built elaborate mythic systems centered on heavenly genealogies, divine realms, and the figure of Seth as a spiritual ancestor. The Valentinians, associated with Valentinus, were often more subtle and intellectually refined. They were closer in some ways to mainstream Christian language while still preserving a distinctly Gnostic metaphysics. Basilides developed his own complex cosmology. The Ophites used serpent symbolism in provocative ways, sometimes reversing conventional readings of Genesis. Marcion is often discussed alongside these movements because of his radical distinction between the just creator God and the higher God of love, though scholars are careful not to collapse all these currents into one single category. And then there is Manichaeism, which developed into a major religion of its own. It was deeply dualistic and global in reach, carrying forward several themes that resonate strongly with the Gnostic worldview. One of the most explosive aspects of Gnosticism was its reading of sacred scripture. Some Gnostic groups did not read the Book of Genesis the way Orthodox Jews and Christians did. In certain interpretations, the serpent becomes not the deceiver, but the awakener, the one who exposes the ignorance of the false creator. That inversion is one reason Gnosticism was considered so subversive. It did not merely disagree with religious authority. It reinterpreted the entire symbolic architecture of the tradition. It asked whether what is praised in public religion might sometimes conceal bondage, and whether what is condemned might, in esoteric terms, symbolize the impulse toward awakening. That does not mean every inversion is wise, or that every rebellion is enlightenment. But it does show exactly how radical the Gnostic imagination really was. Behind all these myths lies something much deeper, something that connects Gnosticism to the perennial. Philosophy. Across many traditions, we find recurring patterns. The soul descends into forgetfulness, becomes entangled in illusion, and must awaken to its true origin through inner transformation. You can find parallels, not identities, but resonances, in Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, strands of Christian mysticism, certain initiatory readings of Kabbalah, and even in later esoteric schools that speak of the divine self hidden beneath the false personality. The language changes and the symbols change, but the structure often remains exactly the same. Exile, memory, awakening, and return. That is why modern esoteric and initiatory circles have continued to take Gnosticism seriously. Rosicrucian thinkers, occult philosophers, theosophical interpreters, and depth psychologists like C.G. Jung all saw something profound in Gnostic symbolism. Jung especially viewed Gnostic myths as maps of inner psychic reality. In that reading, the Demiurge can be understood not only as a cosmic figure, but as the tyrannical structure of the conditioned ego, the false center that claims total authority while remaining cut off from the deeper self. The prison is not only out there, it is also the mechanical mind, the social mask, and the life lived in total identification with appearances. And the spark is that part of us which still remembers. How do serious practitioners apply this in real life? Usually not by rejecting the world in a theatrical way, but by learning to see through its hypnotic force. Through contemplation, self-observation, symbolic study, and disciplined inner work, they try to distinguish essence from conditioning, spirit from compulsion, and awareness from automatism. In practical esoteric terms, gnosis becomes the work of remembering oneself in the midst of fragmentation. For some, this means meditation. For others, it means reading myth and scripture as coded maps of consciousness. For others still, it means treating every attachment, fear, and false certainty as part of the inner architecture of the prison. And honestly, I think this is where Gnosticism becomes most powerful, not when it is reduced to exotic mythology, but when it becomes a mirror. When I first understood that the central problem was not merely being bad, but being inwardly asleep, it changed the way I looked at almost everything. At the same time, Gnosticism is often misunderstood. It is not simply devil worship. It is not just nihilism in ancient robes. It is not one unified church. And it is not a license for spiritual elitism, even though some Gnostic texts do use language that sounds sharply exclusive. At its deepest level, Gnosticism is an attempt to explain why the human soul experiences this world as fractured, why truth feels hidden, and why liberation seems to require more than surface belief. Whether one agrees with its metaphysics or not, it remains one of the boldest efforts ever made to diagnose the spiritual condition of humanity. So maybe the real reason Gnosticism never disappears is that it names a feeling many people secretly carry. It is the sense that we are surrounded by noise, immersed in systems that shape us, rewarded for conformity, and yet haunted by the intuition that something in us belongs to a greater reality. And that brings us back to the question from the beginning. Was Gnosticism dangerous because it was false, or because it taught that the deepest prison is the one mistaken for normal life? Let me know in the comments whether you see the Demiurge as a literal cosmic power, a psychological symbol, or somehow both, because that single question changes the entire way this tradition is read. And if this video helped make one of the most misunderstood subjects in esotericism finally feel clear, leave a like so I know to make more deep explanations just like this. In the end, Gnosticism is not just about ancient sects, lost gospels, or forbidden doctrines. It is about the drama of remembrance. It is about the spark in the human being that refuses to believe that the visible world is all there is. It is about the possibility that salvation begins the moment we stop living mechanically and start seeing. And if that idea speaks to you, subscribe, share this video with someone who would actually appreciate this kind of depth, and watch the playlist on screen right now, because the next video takes this exact same hidden thread even deeper.